Okay, I have the great pleasure of being here with Dr. Karin Tamerius. Dr. Tamerius, thank you so much for joining the Middleway podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, you describe yourself as a political psychiatrist. And I have to say that when I saw that term, maybe the first emotion that I experienced was a little bit of jealousy, actually, that because I think it's such a wonderful, brilliant term, and two things that I'm interested in myself as a psychologist, but also interested in politics. And I just love that you found that overlap. So props to you for coming up with that word. I haven't seen anyone else use that before. But I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your background and how you merged those things. I know that you're a psychiatrist and obviously you have an interest in politics, but what's your background and how did you come to put those two things together?
Sure. Well, the first thing to know is that I don't think anybody sets out to be a political psychiatrist. It's something you kind of stumble into. And when I was starting out with a plan to be a political scientist. And I got a bachelor's degree in political science, and then I went to graduate school in political science, planning to get a PhD. Um, and my specialty when I was studying was political psychology. And the more I got into the psychology part, the more I found myself gravitating toward biological concepts and neurobiology. And I had never really been interested in the hard sciences before, but suddenly it was like, oh my gosh, like there's this whole world out there that I've completely disregarded. And I think I also was, as a lot of people, a little frustrated with the academic lifestyle. I didn't really want to be just running academic studies for the rest of my life and writing papers that only other academics would read. So at some point, I decided, you know what, I'm going to change gears and pursue this fascination with psychology and really go deeper. So actually, I set aside my interest in politics, excuse me, for quite a while, and went to medical school planning to be a psychiatrist. And it was I loved it. I loved the work I was doing. I did several years of residency. And then I had an unexpected twist in my life, which was I developed breast cancer. And it kind of put a pause on everything I was working on. And it, it, so there were like years there where I kind of stepped back from a lot of my work. I had three kids in elementary school at that point, and I was like, you know what, that's all I can focus on. So I did that for several years, and then the 2016 election happened.
Uh-oh.
And for me, that was kind of a big wake up call. Like suddenly I was very interested in politics again. Like I had pulled away, but it suddenly seemed really important um, to re-engage with that. And my kids were old enough at that point that I didn't feel like they needed a mom so much around all the time. And the way I kind of crystallized it for myself was my kids needed democracy more than they need a full-time mom. And so I went to work, and I discovered that actually there was a tremendous amount of overlap in being a political activist and being a psychiatrist, and pulling in all of the knowledge I still had from my political science days. Um, so it has ended up being, it, I never could have anticipated it, and yet all of these pieces fit together perfectly for me in terms of explaining how human beings make decisions about politics, why they do the things they do, what are the most effective ways to make change. And so I draw on all those parts of my training and identity now.
Hmm. There is so much psychology to that, and it's a little bit surprising that we don't recognize or emphasize the role of psychology in politics and political conversations. I want to, get to your organization, Smart Politics, and what you guys actually do, but I'm curious to hear maybe what are some of the practices or tools or things from being a psychiatrist, from working one-on-one with patients that really helped you to do the work that you do now? What are some of the qualities that you notice actually translate into political work?
Yeah, that is a great question, and it's a little funny because it took me a while to see it. Like, even I was initially starting to do political work without seeing the connection to being a psychiatrist. But where it really emerges is when you start having one-on-one conversations with people, particularly one-on-one conversations with people you disagree with. And what I have found is that the same orientation that works in therapy, which is coming into a conversation with unconditional positive regard for the patient, a respect for their personal autonomy, that you're not going to tell them what to think or what to do. You're going to let them make their own decisions and figure out what's best for them. The importance of creating a strong relationship where the patient bonds with you and has affection for you and trusts you as a human being, is really important. And all of those things are absolutely essential in a political conversation too, for the other person and really for you too, to change, to not remain in like this static fixed place where you start the conversation. And then the other thing that is amazing to me is that, just like in therapy, it only takes one person to do that. As long as one person is committed to being non-judgmental, providing a space, like working hard to form a positive relationship, it's going to happen. Even if the other person is highly defensive and scared of moving forward, if you make that effort, if you take those risks, the great things are going to come out of it for both of you. And that's one of the things that's kind of amazing about like the change that happens in psychotherapy. Is the mechanism of change is the same as the change that happens in smart politics conversations.
I love that so much. And yes, when we're doing therapy with someone, we're talking about behavior change. How do we help this person change their behavior, but in the direction of their own values and goals? But maybe they learn something new along the way. Maybe they
Sure.
become curious about what you have to offer, or what I have to offer as a therapist. But I've noticed in my experience that that only happens when that really deep trust is there. If we come in telling them what to do and what to think, then their defenses are going to come up. And I
Yeah.
totally agree with you. It's the
Yeah.
same thing in political conversations as well.
Yeah.
So tell us about Smart Politics. Tell us about the organization and what sort of things that you guys offer.
Yeah, so most of what I do through Smart Politics is teach webinars, and I teach the skills of having better conversations, and that involves often disabusing people of some of their preconceptions about who the people they disagree with are. Smart Politics is a partisan organization in that we are progressive. So the people I work with are generally progressives who are trying to have better conversations with Republicans or independents who they see the world differently than. And a lot of times they come into that space thinking they have a lot of negative attributions about Republicans and independents, and they sometimes they just think they're fundamentally bad people. They tend to think that they're ignorant, or that they are just not that bright. And we've got to kind of walk through those topics and say, no, actually, they're just different. and then we've got to talk a little bit about, well, why are they different? And it's not because of those things that we tend to run to in terms of assuming it's something inherent to the people, something that can't be changed, but rather that they're different because their environment is different, that they were socialized differently. It's important to understand that political identity, party identity, is passed down in families the same way religion is passed down in families. If your parents were Republicans, you are extremely likely to be a Republican. Just like if your parents are Catholics, it's much more likely than average to be a Catholic. And we don't, in our society, we don't tend to pass judgment on people for the religion they inherited from their parents, but we definitely pass judgment on people for the political party that they inherited from their parents. So once people kind of realize that, that helps a lot in changing the thinking that, okay, it's not something inherent to this person. They didn't choose to be a Republican. This is just where life has brought them up until this moment, and they can change. And one of the mechanisms of possible change is having a conversation, because once we have a conversation, then we become part of that socializing environment. And so then it becomes a matter of teaching people the skills of having conversation. And there are two big tools that I teach people about. One is the change conversation cycle, and one is the change conversation pyramid. Do you want me to go into those at this point, or yeah?
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
All right. So the change conversation cycle is a 5-step process that starts with asking a question that is very general and broad and non-judgmental, and invites people into a conversation. Basically, what you're trying to do is to get them to share what they think. The next step is to listen to what they say, which sounds so simple, but in general, we are really bad at listening to other people when we disagree with them, and particularly on the topic of politics. So it's really important for people to learn to pay attention to what the other person is saying for the purpose of understanding them, not for the purpose of refuting what they say, which is what most people do initially in politics.
And Dr. Tamerius, why is it so important to start with that step, the listening piece first?
So the listening piece is really important because it is how you give the other person a chance to feel cared for and feel important. And it also, people often feel like they can't listen until someone else has heard them. It sets up a certain reciprocity. Human beings are naturally reciprocal in the way that we engage. And so when you listen to someone and invite them to share, it is almost like giving them a gift that they, here, you go first. You go ahead and share your thoughts and I will listen to them. And it is only after that that people get to a place where they are willing to give that gift back in many cases.
Lovely, lovely. Okay, so we're inviting people into a conversation. We're allowing them to speak first, and we're practicing listening. What comes after that?
So the next big thing that has to happen is some kind of reflection of reflecting back what they are saying to you. And what that really means is, at the simplest level, it means summarizing what they've said. If they presented some kind of argument, you summarize it back to them as clearly as possible. If they talk about their feelings, you want to acknowledge that and name those feelings. Sometimes a reflection involves naming things that go unsaid. Like, there may be feelings that are actually quite near the surface, but they're not talking about them, but you're picking up on, oh, they're clearly angry about this, or they're clearly afraid that something's going to happen. And so just acknowledging that and saying that out loud, all of those things make the other person feel seen, makes them feel heard. And that is really important in terms of forming a connection and becoming someone who they can trust. And one of the things about political conversations in our current political environment is most people assume that you're not listening to them because they are so accustomed to not being listened to by other people. So that's the other thing that the reflect step really accomplishes, is you're being very explicit about the fact that you're listening. So there's like no question that it's happening. And that's important.
I mean, I have, or at least I intend to have these types of conversations with other people. And it's amazing what happens, how people almost seem to be caught off guard when you do listen and do reflect without trying to refute. And if you can, I know you're going to get to this point, but if we can stay in that space with people, what I've noticed is that people will almost be like, oh, okay, well, actually, what do you think, Matt? What's your take on this? And then they want to know what the other person's perspective is because they've already been heard. But hopefully, I'm not preempting it too much.
No, that's fine. That is really important. You create, once you have heard them and you've made it really clear that you've heard them, they don't need to keep repeating themselves about that. They don't need to perseverate on that argument because you've made it very clear that you've heard it. A lot of times people just keep repeating the same thing over and over in a conversation because they don't think you've heard it. So at that point, that once that has all been named and acknowledged by both parties, then it creates room in the conversation for new material, and they can get curious about what you think because they feel fairly represented in this space. Absolutely. So that is really important. And then I guess the final thing about the reflect step that I find really useful is just that sometimes your reflection is wrong, right? You think you get it, you think you understand what they're saying, you reflect it back, and then they say, no, that's actually not what I meant. And that's like a really important moment because at that point you can say, oh, okay, I'm sorry. Can you explain it again? Until I really understand where you're coming from. And that again demonstrates how committed you are to the process, and that you are really trying to understand where they're coming from. And it also means that going forward in the conversation, once you get to a common understanding, you are on the same footing. You aren't talking about apples and oranges, which so often happens in political conversations.
Completely. So we've got inviting, we have listening, reflecting. Are those 1, 2, 3?
Yeah,
1, 2, and 3.
those are
Okay.
the three.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what comes next?
So the fourth one, people balk at. The fourth one, in many ways, is the hardest for people. It's not the hardest to execute, I think, but psychologically, it's the hardest to get around. And it's agree. So you're having a conversation with someone, they're saying a lot of things that you vehemently disagree with. The next step isn't to tell them they're wrong. The next step is to find the things that they said that you think were right. And most of us, our whole way of interacting, particularly in politics, is to shine a laser on those things where there's disagreement while completely disregarding the areas of agreement. So you do have to learn to shift the way you think. But the agree step is just incredibly powerful for transforming your relationship with the other person. And in most cases, the way it works is it's really hard to agree on things like facts. A lot of times, it's really hard to agree on what I call the 3 Ps, which are politicians, parties, and policies. Those are what people tend to go for first, but it's hard. Like those have been very wedged, but by politicians, and so those are the areas that are most divisive for us. So what can you agree on? In general, it's really easy to agree on things like values, goals, and emotions, actually. So you can talk about, this issue is really hard for me. I have a lot of anger when I think about it. I have a lot of fear. Sounds like you have a lot of anger and fear around this issue too. So I can totally relate to it. Even if your anger and fear are about different aspects, that alone can really bring you together. One of the places where I often find I can easily make progress is take the example of guns. That's an issue where people often talk about it being incredibly frustrating, impossible to talk about with people they disagree with. And where I come down in an agree step is usually, well, I think you and I have some different opinions about how to solve this problem, but we're both on the same page about we want fewer kids dying in school shootings. Like, we both want there to be fewer school shootings, and that is where we make the connection. Yes, we have different ideas about how to solve this problem, but I am right there with you about the urgency of dealing with it.
Thank you so much for that example. That so often gets lost. And I love that really zeroing in and coming down to what's underneath all of this. Well, we can definitely agree on the fact that we don't want more kids dying, or we definitely can agree on the fact that we want our country to be prosperous and we want to be economically sound. And then at the very root of all of it is like, oh, you want to be happy and not suffer. And so do I.
Yes.
And I think if you're totally lost, like, we can always come back to that. Like,
Yeah.
you're just trying to figure out a way to be happy and to help your family. And I mean, I would doubt that many people don't share those values.
Right. Exactly. So it's just a matter of looking for them. And the amazing thing about the agree step is once you do that, there is a complete shift in the dynamic of the conversation. Before, it was you versus me, us versus them. When you reframe it in around common ground, it becomes you and me versus the problem, us versus the problem. Like, we are on the same team. We have formed an alliance. And again, that gets back to psychotherapy. Like, that is what you always want in psychotherapy, is to be on the same team and have a great working alliance.
It's so good. It's so good. And it goes without saying that we just need so much more of this. And maybe this is a question we come back to, but it's like, how did we find ourselves in the position that we're in, where we're not on the same team? We can't recognize that we're trying to collaboratively solve the same problems and we have different ideas. The gap has become so deep that we are seeing other people as fundamentally a threat to like our existence, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have agreed with each other, and there's a fifth and final step, from what I understand.
Fifth and final step, which is the one everyone wants to do first, which is share. You finally get to offer your perspective. At this point, they are ready to hear it. If you offer it before you've gone through all those other steps, they're not going to be ready to hear it. So there's no point. The key thing here is you can't run to make an argument. Arguing doesn't work. So we're all taught in high school, right, how to write the 5-paragraph essay, or we're taught how to, debate. That is not how you engage in an effective conversation if you want to persuade someone. If you do that at this point, you effectively undo all the work you did in the prior 4 steps of the cycle. So, okay, if you want to share your point of view, then how do you do it? And the way to do it is to share experiences, to share a story about an experience you had personally, or a story about an experience that someone else you've heard of had. So let's go back to the gun issue, for example. If I'm going to use an experience of my own, I might talk about how some of my concerns around guns tend to stem from the fact that I had a family member who shot someone, and he wasn't a bad guy. He was a great guy, actually, but it was in the heat of the moment when his daughter was in a fight with someone and his gun was handy, and he shot him just without thinking, and the guy died. And that, to me, is one of those, like, for me, that was a really formative experience, in realizing that sometimes having a gun handy sometimes can be really dangerous, because people aren't always thinking clearly. So sharing a story like that holds the kernel of a different way of seeing the issue. The beauty of sharing a personal story is that it can't be disputed, right? If I share a bunch of facts, they can always come back and they can dismiss it, they can deny it, they can, bring up their own facts, whatever. But if I tell a personal story, that's my story. That can't be denied. The second thing is, when you tell a story, it kind of circumvents the brain's defense system. When you come at it with an argument, the defenses are up. People are analyzing the argument to find the holes. When you come with a story, the brain just accepts it as is. And when facts are embedded in stories, information is embedded in stories, then it's also retained better. Our brains are wired for stories, not for facts. And then finally, what I think everyone understands intuitively is that stories are emotional, and we empathize with the main characters in a story. That's what happens. You don't empathize with data. You don't empathize with debate arguments. You do empathize with the characters in a story. And so you get past some of the common problems that we have in political conversations in that way.
Are there moments, Dr. Tamerius, are there particular situations where people, where sharing an argument would be effective, and what are some signs to look for that it would be appropriate and effective to do so? And on the contrary, are there certain situations where it actually wouldn't even be helpful to take the step of sharing a personal story, where it should just be more about listening? I know that's a two-pronged question.
So yeah. Okay. So are there times when sharing information can be effective? Absolutely. But it usually requires a really high degree of trust. Like the relationship has to get to a pretty advanced place in order for that to happen. And some of the things that need to happen are that you have to establish what I think of as cognitive trust, not just like emotional relationship-based trust. So the other person has to see you as basically not crazy. Like,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
They have to be like, you know, like, okay, she thinks differently from me, but she's not totally out of left field. Like
she's got some credibility in my book
yeah,
on some things.
exactly. Um, they need to see you in some way as intelligent, like smart enough to be talking about this issue, like a sense that you have something good to say or to contribute to the conversation. It can also be really useful to be seen as unbiased. And that one's tricky because what you're trying to do is persuade, but you need to demonstrate that you are able to look at an issue from both sides. So if you have demonstrated that you can see good and bad aspects of a proposal, if you highlight the fact that you have ambivalence about things, and you can say, I think there are good things about Biden and some things I don't like so much about Biden. Like that's really important for building your credibility. And then finally, if you can establish that you have some expertise on an issue, not in an arrogant way, but just in a way that you've looked into this and you have some things to offer, then they're much more likely to listen to like a presentation of evidence. In general, you're always going to be better off in that situation if they ask before you offer. If you do offer, you need to ask them if it's okay and get their permission. Don't just like dump it on them, because a lot of times people aren't ready to hear things, and that's perfectly fine. And you want to do it with as much humility as possible. Like, this is what I've heard. This is what I think. What do you think about that? Or have you heard things like that before? Rather than going at it like, well, here's the argument, here's the facts, and this is why it's true, and you should accept this.
Perfect. And then how about on the other side of the coin? Are there moments where it would be wise to actually just pull back and not share?
Yeah, so there are lots of conversations I have where I never get to the share step, and that's fine. Sometimes there are a couple things that drive that. I mean, like you say, sometimes people just aren't ready. It's good enough to just be working on building trust. And it's amazing how powerful trust is all by itself.
Mm.
So sometimes I find, I can cycle through kind of the first 4 steps over and over again without ever going to share. And at the end of the conversation, they have kind of changed their view, not just of me as a person, but of Democrats in general. My favorite thing is to get on an airplane and sit next to, someone who's far to the right of me and just start a conversation about politics, and then, but not reveal until the end that, I am from the East Bay.
That's the giveaway,
and then I'm a Democrat.
obviously.
And it's always like their response is, "What? No, you can't be. You're too sane. Like that's
Exactly.
that's not possible."
Exactly.
And that to me is like the perfect. That is a huge win, because it breaks down stereotypes, and those stereotypes are problematic. The second thing I would say, so that's one example of where it's really powerful. A second thing is, you can have a lot of impact on what people think without ever sharing anything. And you would know that as a therapist, right? It is simply reflecting back what you have heard, often causes people to rethink what they're thinking. They hear themselves, and then you say it back, and they're kind of like, maybe that may not be quite the way I want to think about it. And that works particularly well when people are voicing some really extreme beliefs, or are particularly upset and angry and revved up, and giving them some space to really reflect on what they're saying by just holding up a mirror, saying, "Look, this is you. I'm not passing judgment, but this is you." Often will cause them to be like, "Well, not really. Like, I don't really mean that. Like, I wouldn't really want them to be hurt, or I wouldn't really want the government overthrown." Or it's amazing how people will actively change while you're watching in a conversation without ever saying anything.
Amazing. So really, I mean, one of the major takeaways here from what you're saying, I think, is that we can actually change people's minds without trying to change people's minds. And
yes, and that's the paradox, right? The paradox is, the harder you try to change someone's mind, the worse you're gonna do. You've got to, yes, you can want to change someone's mind, but you need to focus on the process, not on the changing of the mind. I think there's a saying about, this is probably like a Zen saying or something, but about shooting an arrow. And to be successful in shooting an arrow, you need to focus on the target, not focus on like winning the trophy. And I think of a conversation when someone's mind is being changed as the changing of the mind is the trophy, but you can't be focused on that while you're having the conversation. You have to be focused in on your relationship with the person you're talking with.
Beautiful, beautiful. That is the power comes in the relationship, in the understanding, and that power can bring depolarization.
Yes.
So that leads me back to your organization, Smart Politics, and one of, as you say, your mission is to depolarize, and at the same time, there's also a political advocacy motivation behind it. So help us understand kind of how those two things go together, or how to square those two things.
Yeah. So over time, I've realized that polarization, and here I want to define it a little bit as toxic polarization, because polarization by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that there are groups who disagree with each other, and that's kind of the basis of democracy, that groups are going to disagree with each other. That's okay. It's problematic when we start having really negative feelings about each other as a result of those disagreements. And the fascinating thing in contemporary American politics is that our attitudes haven't actually moved any farther apart for the most part. Like, if you look at public opinion polling over the last 20 years or so, the median Democrat and the median Republican are fairly similar, particularly if you include people who lean Democrat or lean Republican. And that's voters. That's very different from people who are in office. So put them aside. They don't count. But when it comes to voters, we're not that far apart. What has changed is that we hate each other now in a way that we really haven't before, probably since the Civil War.
Do you mean we're not that far apart on policy issues?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So that's really important to understand, because the real problem is the feelings about each other. It's not the policy disagreements. So from the perspective of smart politics, we think it is those feelings, that toxic polarization or affective polarization, that is the biggest barrier to achieving our policy goals. It's not a disagreement about policy that is the biggest problem. And so until we get more people feeling either more positively toward us, or at least not so negatively toward us, we're going to have a lot of trouble getting anything done. So that's why we make that the central focus of our work.
So I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this interview, and so like, if we kind of use the formula that we're describing here, from the perspective of smart politics, we're assuming that we can get people to think more progressively. But I'm assuming, that because you trust in the formula, that the same thing might happen conversely, that if you're having a conversation with someone, you might be more open or interested, or start leaning more to the other side of the aisle. And so I wanted to ask you about that. And particularly, I wanted to kind of pick your brain on, if you think that having these conversations naturally lends itself to progression, meaning that almost like if you see it, that's almost like the natural fundamental bend or trajectory of the world, and that if we can truly have unbiased conversations, that we will uncover that all by ourselves. Is that the way that you see things?
I wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
I feel like I don't have enough data on that. I think that is a hypothesis that I'm willing to explore, and it's possible. But I don't know. But for me, that doesn't have to be true for me to pursue this course of action. One of the things I tell people is, if there was a Republican who came to me and said they wanted to create a Republican smart politics, and to kind of work as a parallel organization, I'd be like, fine. That's great. Let's get these tools into the hands of as many people as possible, because whatever comes out of this, whether, I personally think it's going to be more progressive policies. I think if Democrats do this, it's going to help us achieve our political goals. But even if that doesn't happen, if these ideas get out there, people begin to connect with one another more and have more authentic conversations, there's no downside to that. You know, it's always going to be better. And maybe what we discover is that there are even better ways than what we Democrats are currently thinking of right now for solving society's problems. Like maybe Republicans have some good ideas that we should be considering more. And maybe if we could actually sit down and talk these things through, we would be able to come up with a synthesis that would be way better than anything either of us is thinking of right now. I mean, to me, fundamentally, smart politics is a form of democratic practice. Like, this is what it means to live in a democracy and accept your fellow citizens where they are, value their views no matter what they believe, like value them as human beings no matter what they believe, and being willing to invest in relationships with everyone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like I'm sort of hearing it as like, you know, really putting the process first of having these conversations. But at the same time, having something that you believe in and something you stand for and some direction that you believe we should go in, because we don't have to be agnostic about those things. And then on top of that, being willing to be flexible enough if we discover some other way of doing things that's
Right.
better. And that's that key piece, I think, that's really hard for just as a human being, right? I mean, because having beliefs and values, but that's lovely.
Yeah. It's this is what really distinguishes me, I think, from a lot my work from a lot of the bridging organizations that are out there, purely bridging organizations, because for them, taking like advocacy is anathema to their mission from their perspective. Like you can't bridge and advocate for a policy goal in their view. And in my position is no, you can advocate and you can bridge bill at the same time. Both of those things can exist simultaneously. And not only that, I think that when people are interested in politics because they want to make change and because they have ideas about how to make change. And when you ask them to come to a bridging conversation and take that part of them that's passionate about change and making a difference and put it aside and say, no, that's not, you don't get to work on that. You just have to come here and be with these other people. I think it's really hard to get people to come together because what draws people to politics is the desire to make change. So that's, I think that's one of the things that smart politics has going for it is we really say, this is the way to accomplish your goals.
I think it'd be really wonderful to have a Republican smart politics like sister organization, almost modeling exactly what you're talking about. And, you know, to your point, it would probably serve both, because the polarization of things stagnates and does not help either party, either side of it. And so whether you're a Democrat or Republican, everyone's invested in depolarizing, because you're actually get at least some of your stuff done or some things accomplished versus nothing at all.
Right.
Awesome. This has been so fantastic. Oh, I wanted to ask you about chatbots as well, because you've done some work, some consulting work around chatbots and helping people to actually practice having these conversations. So can you tell us about the work that you've done and maybe what we might look out for on the horizon of things?
The horizon of chatbots, yes. So I've done some chatbots in the New York Times, and the purpose of the chatbots is really to provide people with practice having difficult conversations. Two of the bots in the New York Times walk people through the change conversation cycle, so they actually get to practice talking with someone who disagrees with them, and it offers up likely choices you might have to make in a conversation. So the bot says something to you that you disagree with, and you're given an option, 3 options of what to say in response. And 2 of those are not very productive responses, and 1 is usually a good way to keep the conversation going. And if you make the wrong choice, then you get some feedback about, why that probably wasn't the best response. And you even get to see how the bot responds. So the bot often gets very angry when you choose the wrong response. And, people like it because they actually, it really mimics effectively the real dynamics of conversations and how easily they go off the rails, and how our intuitions about how to have a conversation are just tremendously at odds with what actually works. And one of the things people often say to me is, I'm going through the chatbot and I know what the wrong answer is. I know what the right answer is, and I just don't want to choose the right answer, which I find fascinating. Like, it's just, there is this emotional tug to the wrong answer, to saying the wrong thing, that is really hard to overcome in having these conversations. So getting better at our own emotional regulation is really important when we start doing this work. And so for now, these are just scripted conversations, branching conversations. But what I'm hoping in the future is that we can use AI to actually simulate these chats and make them much more realistic, so that people could actually enter anything, say anything they want to the bot, and have it respond realistically to what they say.
One of the things I'm interested in, and this maybe should be a follow-up conversation for us, because I think relevant to work that you do, work that I do, is that, like, how do you invite people into doing that sort of practice? I think that the way that we're relating to each other right now, as much as we understand that it's toxic, it's also addicting in a way. And so inviting people to practice these skills, like, from your experience as a psychiatrist and your experience in politics, what would be an effective way to actually invite people into doing this that's not going to make them feel defensive, but interested, and there's something there for them?
It's hard. It's hard. One of the things I find is that the people who are most willing to make the transition to using these skills are people who have Republicans in their families, or people who they disagree with strongly in their families. And because they don't have, in a lot of cases, they don't have the choice of not having those relationships. They have to continue engaging, and they're looking for ways to make that happen, because they feel they have so much at stake. They're willing to invest in mastering these skills and learning how to do this. It is definitely harder with people who have, who could choose just not to engage, which is the easier thing by far. Where what I found is there comes a point with a lot of people where they realize that whatever political activism they're engaging in isn't achieving the results they want, where they're kind of coming up against a wall in terms of their political practice. Like, there are only so many protests you can go to. There are only so many times you can call your member of Congress or make a donation. And a lot of times there is no connection to taking those activities, engaging in those activities and actually achieving some kind of change. And there comes a realization that if they want to make a difference, they need to find another path.
Yeah.
And that's what smart politics offers, is a path that actually, in my view, is actually the path that works. Unlike most of what we do, which is either avoiding or getting into arguments, or engaging in political activities that are kind of have no real impact on outcomes. Like this is something that actually moves the needle. It's just really hard to do.
100%. And I think, it's so applicable as well, not just on the one-on-one level, but the way I see it also on a wider level. Political movements and campaigns and candidates should be using these same rhetorical skills or these same concepts to be able to build empathy with people and listen and understand. I don't know how much they are using them, but if anyone's listening here, 2024 candidates.
So there is very slowly a transition that's happening in the political world with the emergence of deep canvassing, which there's a big overlap between deep canvassing and smart politics. And I actually talk about that in my forthcoming book, which most of the work that I do has to do with kind of just talking with friends and family and neighbors and people you encounter in your life. But you can also do this in a very organized way. And you can do it on the campaign trail. And in a way, that's what deep canvassing is. It's about, taking traditional canvassing where you go and knock on people's doors and kind of read them a script and then see who are you planning to vote for, and then go on to the next door. And the whole interaction takes about 5 minutes and the other person doesn't get to say anything. Deep canvassing is you spend 15 minutes at the person's door and they do all the talking and you do all the listening. And you form a real relationship. And then you tell a story that can potentially shift their view on the issue. So that is beginning to happen. It's having measurable effects. The problem is it scares, I call it the campaign consulting industrial complex. They are very concerned about giving up the reins of control because you can't control the message once you let somebody go off script during deep canvassing, and they want to control the message.
Right.
So that has been a big barrier to doing this work. I think it's as the evidence mounts that this is much more effective and powerful, like gradually that we're going to see a change, but it's taking a while for the consulting industry to catch up.
Okay, you mentioned your book. And so I wanted to hear a little bit about that and when you anticipate it coming out. But the title of it being How to Talk So Republicans Will Listen, a Political Psychiatrist's Guide to Winning Conversations. When can we anticipate this book, and can we anticipate it within this next election cycle, hopefully?
I am aiming for September 2024. So hopefully you can have it in your hands before the election. Yes.
Awesome. Fantastic. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you wanted to share with our audience?
I think the other thing we didn't talk about is the change conversation pyramid. Do we have time to address that?
Let's do it. Let's talk about it. And this will be new for me.
All right. So the change conversation pyramid is a lot like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I'm sure you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which basically addresses, what are human motivations at any given moment in life. And we know at a very basic level, we all need to eat and drink and things like that. And once we're able to fulfill our physiological needs, then we can start thinking about things like shelter, and then we can start thinking about our relationships, and it moves up like that. Well, it turns out there's basically a similar hierarchy of needs that people have in conversations. And if, as we climb this hierarchy of needs, people's defenses come down. So it actually, the way I think about it, is a way of building trust in a relationship, so that you can get to a place where the other person will listen to what you have to say. So the first and most important level is comfort. And it just means that the person has to feel safe enough to be in a conversation with you. That means they have to feel like you're not going to try to control them. You're not going to call them nasty names. You're not going to think that they're a bad person if they say something you don't like. That your relationship is still going to be intact if you disagree about something. That's the most basic level. Everybody needs to have a conversation. The second level is connect. So we need in some way to form a relationship with the person we're talking with. And the relationship is usually about things like affinity. So a sense that we have things in common, and also trust. So I can trust you to not like that you're going to engage like a person should in this conversation. And one of the things that I find really helpful in that regard is to make myself vulnerable in a conversation in some way, because once I make myself vulnerable, then the other person feels much more comfortable opening up. So I might say something about, I'm a little anxious about having this conversation because, I know you and I tend to disagree on politics a lot, and I don't want you to think of me as a bad person because of that. And once you admit something like that, it makes it much easier for them to also be open about their reservations and feelings. The third step is under comprehension, making sure that you understand where they're coming from and what it's like to be them at some fundamental level. The fourth step is compassion. So that is really about showing that you care about them, that this is not just, excuse me, some kind of cognitive exercise. And you're not just out for yourself, but you care about what happens to them and other people they care about. A lot of times we don't, in our political conversations, we do not express any empathy for the person we disagree with. And that is a huge mistake. Like, it's really important, even if you don't agree with them, to validate them and empathize with their suffering. Whether you think they should be suffering or not is irrelevant. If they are suffering, they are suffering. And it's important to, be compassionate about that. And then the final step is cognition. And that's the place where you finally reach a point where they start to trust your point of view. They're willing to hear it and listen to it. Unfortunately, most of the time what people do in conversations is they start at the top of the pyramid not the bottom. Like they just immediately want to go for cognition. And it's like, no,
Right.
if you don't do all that other stuff first, they're not going to listen to you.
Hmm. So good. This is so good. Do you have the pyramid on your website
Yeah,
that people can access? Because I will put it in the show notes for
I
folks.
will. I can send you a copy of it if it's not on the website. So I
Perfect.
will look.
Perfect. So I will try to share that with our audience, make that accessible
Cool.
somehow. But other resources, other ways that people can um, get in touch with you or get involved with the organization or learn from Smart Politics, where can they
Right,
find you?
right. So the website is joinsmart.org. So go there. You can join the mailing list and sign up to receive regular information. So whenever I teach an event, you know, that's how we let people know about it.
Some amazing. This has been so wonderful. I so deeply appreciate you and the work that you do. I can't say enough about how important it is. So thank you for doing that. And thank you everyone for listening. Hopefully you walked away with something tangible. There were so many really useful skills and tools and very practical things that you shared today that I know will resonate with people. So thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.